So good morning. I want to welcome everybody. We're at the 11 o'clock hour. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a few people continuing to pop in. So I'm going to do just some introductions right now. So I'll start with myself. My name is Ann Ayers. I am the Dean of the Colorado Women's College at the University of Denver, which is just really fun and a great honor. Our students did a great job getting online today and all week long. So that was fun to hear from our faculty this morning that everyone's doing well. And I, in this capacity, have really had the privilege of serving the DU community and being part of the DU community in a really special way through an initiative called Community Plus Values. And the effort in Community Plus Values is really to connect better with our community, to let the community know that DU is here for them, also that we're here for one another, and to create community with a big C, as we've been saying, because I think we all belong to our small groups in our classes, our departments, our units, our alumni groups, and we want to make sure that there's a bigger sense of belonging to the greater purpose at DU. So that's a big part of what we're doing in Community Plus Values, and our way of doing that during this crazy time right now is to reach out to you with some interesting virtual programming, and to do that in areas that we are hearing are relevant to you. And I certainly know that our talk today, so well-being in the virtual world and coping with distress related to isolation, stigma, and uncertainty, is incredibly important to me. In talking to my teams and my families, and my family, well, I do have multiple families, I suppose. My mom is one of 10 kids. I feel like I have family everywhere. But in talking to just folks in my life, I think we're hitting a new plateau of, I don't know, I guess these things happen in stages. And so I'm really happy that we get to hear a little bit about those stages, and maybe we can't really know what to expect in the outside world, but maybe if we can know what to expect in here and up here, and you all can help us with that today, I think that would be really valuable. So I'm really excited about the conversation. I want to introduce you to our fabulous panelists who are taking time out of their days and counseling and teaching. And, you know, sometimes you read through people's bios, and I'm always humbled in an academic sense. But in particular, I looked at these and I thought, I just see yes in all of these, in all of your bios. You must say yes to everything, because you're doing so many things in the community that are remarkable. I want to introduce Dr. Rohini Gupta, if you'll give a wave so people can put a face with the name. She's a clinical psychologist, a core faculty member at the University of Denver Graduate School for Professional Psychology, and works in International Disaster Psychology Program, and is the director of the Trauma and Disaster Recovery Clinic, which is a training clinic that provides mental health services to those who've experienced adversity and trauma. And she co-developed, I'm really interested in this, I want to learn more about this from you, Rohini, down the road, the Colorado Resilience Collaborative, a community-based initiative aimed at addressing identity-based violence due to radicalization and discrimination. So really hard and relevant topics, just kind of that I'm seeing throughout. You also run healing workshops, which I think is amazing, and you're on the board of the Women's March. And I don't want to spend all day on your bio, so we're going to move to the next person. But it really is so inspiring. It inspires me to say yes to more things. And then Dr. Christine DeVore is here with us as well. If you want to just kind of give a quick wave. Thank you for joining us. Christine is a clinical psychologist who specializes in grief and loss issues, perinatal mental health, so that would be pregnancy through the first year after birth, psychosocial oncology, and women's issues. So that's near and dear to our heart at the Women's College. We think a lot about those things. I'm glad to get to know you through this forum, and expect a call soon. We'd love to wrap you into our work if you'll say that yes to that too. And you manage a general practice of adult clients and treat a variety of issues such as depression, anxiety, and trauma in that area. Also an adjunct professor here at the University of Denver, where you teach psychology and grief loss to graduate students. Does that sound all like it fits you? All right. And then Nicole, hi. Nicole Bozas is a first-year doctoral student in clinical psychology at DU, also at GSPP, the Graduate School for Professional Psychology. Nicole is a multilingual practitioner with a higher language proficiency in English and Spanish. You're currently completing a year-long externship under supervision, doctoral supervision, assisting with neurodevelopmental evaluations. which I think is so interesting. We're learning so much about the brain and getting rid of the stigma of mental health through doing that. So thank you for doing that work. You have a BA in behavioral science with a focus in psychology from Metro, and then your master's in forensic psychology with a concentration in military psychology from the University of Denver. So we are in such good hands. And with all of that, I'm just going to give kind of what we're going to do here is I'm going to pop off. I'm going to let these three fabulous folks have a really directed and important conversation for about 35 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. And then I'll jump back in and be the voice of the folks who've joined us online. Put your questions into the Q&A, put them into the chat window, and we will get going. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne, for the introduction and for the Community and Values Initiative for having us here today. And we are going to start with a conversation about isolation and start with a question to Christine. So Christine, I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about the common sources of stress during social distancing and isolation that's going on with COVID-19.
Yeah, and first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me, and it's a privilege to work with Rohini and also with Nicole and get to know her as well. So thank you for having me here. So I have the honor of working with clients through this health crisis, but also mental health crisis. Where I work, there's 15 clinicians who are still actively seeing clients as well as myself. And what I hear from them and what in their work and what I'm hearing from the clients that I'm working with is that there is so much fear and anxiety in the isolation in terms of maybe being sick or getting someone else sick. We also are hearing that parents are struggling with feeling like they have to have it all figured out right now, that they have to be educators and homeschoolers and also maintain employment or be working from home in addition to parenting 24/7. With isolation and loss of that maybe physical support, we're hearing people are having a hard time with change, that there's a loss of normalcy right now. People are also struggling with, so a common source is people are either alone right now or they're isolated with other people, and they are having a hard time getting away or separating or finding space for themselves. So in my clinical work, clients are struggling with that probably the majority of the time that we're talking about, and how can you cope with that? I think another major source of stress is employment. So maintaining employment at home or not having it right now, and then the financial stress that comes. And then access to services. If you need services in your life, like assistance, healthcare, food, internet, that is compromised right now, and that's a big source of stress. And so with all of these things, we're seeing fear, anxiety, depression, boredom, anger, stigma, frustration, and all of those are so normal and expected right now.
So Christine, do you feel like there are people who are more vulnerable than others when we're thinking about isolation during this time?
Yeah, I think so. I think, people that would be vulnerable in this time are older adults. They may have a loss of support. They may have a loss of access to services, and they are more health-wise at risk. So their isolation is even more important. We also would be concerned about people with a disability who maybe need a specialized diet and don't have access to the food they need right now. We're also seeing that people with disabilities who may need assistance in getting around the house or getting their med boxes filled, that they're not able to get that assistance at home, maybe from family or neighbors or even caregivers coming into their house, so they're not getting that care. And then we'd also want to think about someone being more at risk mental health-wise if they had a pre-existing mental health condition. If someone had a previous diagnosis of anxiety, depression, maybe bipolar disorder, that the isolation and the fear and anxiety, uncertainty, and loss can really elevate and spike up those symptoms.
Yeah, Christine, what do you think are some of the coping strategies for isolation during this time? What would you suggest?
What I've been talking with clients about, and we've been talking about this in our consultation groups and private practice, is helping build hope and having those conversations with people, talking with people about resilience. How can they foster resiliency? We've been having conversations about gratitude and honing in on values and building perspective and encouraging people to be thankful for what they do have in the face of loss or destruction. Something that we've also been talking about is helping people gain control in a time of isolation. And so we are even thinking about, is there some act of kindness you could do, or some act of altruism that you could do? Could you donate to a cause? Could you reach out to a vulnerable person in your life? And really pushing people to challenge this idea of maybe being powerless or helpless in this time by an act of kindness. And then some other things we can do are maintaining a healthy lifestyle, so getting our sleep, proper nutrition, physical activity. We also want to think about keeping some semblance of normalcy. So, keeping some of the joys and positives in your life from before, maintaining routine, structure in your day, and some sort of organization to it. And I would also suggest limiting news. The news right now can spike up fear and anxiety in our isolation, and we want to really be mindful about balancing that out with these healthy coping strategies. And we also want to make sure we're getting our news from reputable sources like the CDC or the WHO, that we want to make sure we're getting accurate information in this time of isolation.
Thank you.
So what do you think happens next, Christine? What happens after this period of quarantine and isolation ends?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a range of feelings. I think people are going to have anxiety. I think they'll also feel relief. People are going to experience grief and loss, but people could also experience spiritual growth or personal growth and find some sort of bigger perspective or meaning in all of this for them individually. And so I think, while we don't know what's next, we know that there's going to be a range of emotions and that that's normal and that that's expected. And what we would want to talk about is if people are having elevated symptoms of those emotions I just talked about, we'd want to talk to them about getting professional help. So if someone's experiencing extreme stress, disturbed sleep, and so that means they're not sleeping their usual amount, or they're waking up numerous times at night, they're not engaged in their daily routine, or they can't get there, then we would want to talk to them about getting some professional help. And there are so many options for telehealth, whether that's an individual support session or group therapy online, or just other online communities for support. A professional can help navigate that with someone. And so that's what I would have to say about that. And so on that note, I'd like to switch over and throw something back to Nicole. And I know you want to talk to us about uncertainty, so I'd want to ask you, knowing how COVID is affecting us with isolation, what does uncertainty look like during COVID?
I mean, as you had mentioned before, there's a lot of mental health coming out for people here, whether it be anxiety or depression. Also, just that isolation piece can do a lot regarding mental health. And along with that comes this period of uncertainty of knowing what to do in the day-to-day moments, as well as when will this end? And we're kind of entering a new territory here with COVID-19. We haven't seen a pandemic in the US in a long time, and there's concern on how to plan and maintain that sense of normalcy you talked about, Christine. And yet at the same time, we're wired as people for certainty. We want to be able to plan even if we don't feel like we're planners, and we want to know what our day-to-day experience will look like. We thrive on structure and experience, and when we don't have those things, it creates a lot of health anxiety, worry, concern. And when dealing with uncertainty and change, we forget as people that change is a difficult place to be for anybody, and yet we avoid change. And this change right now is happening to everyone on so many different levels. It doesn't matter if your life is like impacted and still having to go to work, and yet there are people who are financially, emotionally, relationally being impacted here. I mean, the way that we work out or get our groceries or communicate or get our education, we're being impacted on every level. And so this uncertainty leads to many of the emotions that people are experiencing in isolation, as well as like financial stressors. This is a really tough time for us to be in.
Yeah, so Nicole, I'm curious, as a student in the field of psychology, what have you noticed in relation to the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, so I would say that students are no exception to what people are experiencing across the globe right now. I mean, obviously being in a doctoral program and having access to technology, that changed a little bit than maybe if I were an elementary school kid, have you, but there's a sense of urgency being put upon us as we attempt to respond to these changes in our schedules and structures. You know, from a perspective of psychology and going back to what Christine was talking about with gratitude, there's also this opportunity that has been created. And so I think students now are trying to balance this opportunity versus requirement to adjust to how we learn and access information, and the environment that we create around that. And as someone who personally struggles with time management, you know, time management is no longer a helpful skill. It's required. It's a required option at this point to be successful. And it's a rude awakening to how much time we actually have versus how much time we perceive to have. So as someone who's a student, and it sounds like we have students listening in here, I encourage people to reach out to their supports in their schools, their colleagues. I promise you, you're not the only one going through this. And I don't think that I would be adjusting to time management as well if I didn't have the colleagues that we have. So resources exist, and also have a sense of compassion for yourself. No one thought that we would be doing education through Zoom. No one thought that we would have to have access to technology in our homes. So have some room for compassion.
Nicole, given the uncertainty of the duration of this virus, how can people feel a sense of safety and well-being?
I mean, both of those are incredibly important here, and it ties a lot into what you had been talking about in regards to isolation. First, I would say that everyone is responding to this differently based on their own experiences. It's so easy to get sucked into what we're experiencing as well as what the rest of the world is experiencing. And it's easy to fall into that panic and fear of doing the right thing. And so I would say, like, know your own health risks, know your own choices, know your own schedule, and make the right choices for you and your loved ones. And have this like discussion around the fears that you have. I mean, it's normal to be experiencing, as Christine stated, these fears and uncertainties of what's going on. And so talk about what's happening for you internally to people that you trust or mental health professionals. And then stay at home if you're not sick when it goes to the safety part, please. Regarding the well-being piece, I mean, making a routine, I think Christine, you touched on this, is incredibly important. It helps create that sense of normalcy, and it's important on trying to feel safe. But when we're talking about well-being, I view this as both physical and mental health well-being. So putting those together, there are things that we can do for ourselves while we're isolated or in self-quarantine. So like making sure you still get outside, sunlight, fresh air, so important here for a sense of well-being. And then if you're able to get moving, like actual physical exercise, that is incredibly important as well, not only just because we're actually moving our bodies and releasing some stress, but also What we know in psychology is that when we're experiencing long-term stress or intense stress in one moment, we get a buildup of cortisol, and that could be a whole nother webinar. But I would say that, oxygen, the more oxygen we get into our body, it decreases our cortisol levels. But if you're not able to get moving and active and running, stretch, do some yoga, deep breathing, walk around your block with a pet if you have one. And then there are other ways that we can also kind of clear the noise in our head. You mentioned, Christine, avoiding the news. Yes, please. Like, listen to the people who are giving us like reliable information, so CDC and the WHO. But we still have to find, and I go back to this, creating that space. We still have to find space in our homes to clear the noise. So that could be something like deep breathing or coloring or yoga. That could also just be creating that space, like, hey, honey, I'm going to go to the patio for a minute. Or I need some moments in the bathroom alone, away from the kids or something. Like, we are all people dealing with the best we can. So we have to find ways to clear the noise. And you could also use like grounding strategies, like deep breathing, connecting to your five senses, just taking a moment in the day to recenter yourself. And I challenge people to stay present. That is probably the best thing that we can do to help support our well-being.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I mean, really helpful suggestions in terms of how to cope with uncertainty. Any kind of final thoughts about kind of coping during this time?
I would just say, and this goes a little bit to the isolation piece, we naturally feel helpless when we're experiencing change and aren't in control of what's going on. So, you could reach out to people you talk, donate, explore resources. But one of the other suggestions I would have is making a resiliency plan. You can plan for the future by just a day or a week at a time with the current situation in mind to help recreate that structure and routine. And finding these activities you can do on a regular basis to just really support your well-being.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And next we wanted to talk about stigma and as it relates to this virus. And I'd love to hear from Rohini, about her thoughts about stigma and as it relates to COVID-19.
Yeah, so Christine and Nicole, thank you. I mean, you've done a great job in kind of talking about the fear and the anxiety that exists. And along that, with pandemics comes stigma. And unfortunately, stigmatizing groups during pandemics is not a new thing and is not uncommon during this time of stress. When people associate a risk with a specific group, and then there's no evidence that that risk is greater in that group in comparison to the general population, stigma can occur. And there's been a long history in the United States in scapegoating ethnic minority groups during pandemics. So for example, with HIV/AIDS, we had Haitians who were demonized and denied entry into the United States because it was thought that they would bring that with them. Italian immigrants were blamed for polio. And with COVID-19, in terms that are being used, such as the Chinese virus, has fueled a number of anti-Asian sentiment in the community. And so when we think about why this happens, when communities have negative representations of certain groups that already exist and stereotypes that already exist, such as seeing falsely certain groups as dangerous or unworthy or outsiders, then it's much more likely that we see them as disease carriers or as health burdens. Now, since March 18th, there have been 650 direct reports of discrimination primarily against Asian Americans. And so when we think about the psychological impact of that, I mean, stigma hurts everyone. It can create more fear, more anger. And so instead of focusing on the disease and coming together to try to solve the problem, right, we may scapegoat groups, and that hurts both those individuals, the groups that they belong to, and the community as a whole.
So you mentioned the reference of this being referred to as the Chinese virus. What type of experiences have you noticed that Asian Americans are undergoing right now?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Nicole. I wanted to kind of share just very brief incidences that I've heard or read about with all of you for us to really get a sense of what this looks like. So a Chinese American man stood in line to vote last week in the US and took a sip of water and began to choke. The man in front of him said, "All you Asian people are spreading the coronavirus. Stay away from here." A woman who was trying to get a ride from the airport was refused service and told by the driver that he would not pick up people with Asian sounding names. An Asian American man was walking down the street. Someone next to him coughed, and although it wasn't him who coughed, people turned around and glared at this man, and they covered their mouth, and they said, the man who experienced this, the Asian American man, said, "They look at me and think I'm some kind of virus." A woman of Asian descent was walking to her gym and noticed a man shouting at her. She heard him scream, "Run them over." She tried to keep her distance, and when the light changed, she caught up with her and she could feel him staring at her. And then suddenly she felt his saliva hitting her face. A woman wearing a face mask in New York was punched and called a disease. So these are just some of the many incidences that have occurred since the start of COVID-19, and really wanted to kind of bring some of those stories into this space to really acknowledge and name what is happening. And what happens is people live then in a state of fear, and that fear that the individual experiences, right, the community hears about it. And then it ripples kind of to other communities, where then it kind of creates a bigger sense of fear that kind of ripples throughout. And I do want to say that it runs alongside sort of the model minority stereotype that characterizes Asian Americans as sort of polite, law-abiding group that achieved higher levels of success in the general population. And one challenge with this stereotype is that it can be harmful, and that it can hide the struggle that this group experiences, and also kind of create a sense of invisibility that can really have an impact on someone's sort of psychological well-being and sense of who they are and identity.
Rohini, could you talk a little bit more about those mental health impacts on these various groups that have been stigmatized?
Yes, I mean, in addition to the normal stressors that we see with pandemics that Nicole, Christine, that you both have talked about, that we all are experiencing to some degree, there is the additional stress related to discrimination, acts of aggressions, and that added stress during a time of pandemic can contribute to lower levels of psychological well-being among ethnic minority groups. So it's not only that the stress of the pandemic, but then the stress of these incidences or hearing about these incidences can also have, and very similar to Christine and Nicole, some of the mental health impacts that you talked about are certainly relevant here in terms of the anxiety, the fear. Sometimes some of those symptoms can show up in our bodies somatically. So thinking about headaches, insomnia, it could also, that stress can exacerbate physical ailments that people are struggling. And so those are some things for us to really think about in terms of mental health impact. So to summarize, right, there's the stress of the pandemic, and then the stress gets exacerbated by kind of those experiences of discrimination.
Rohini, Christine and I, we hadn't directly named this, but one of the things that we can manage during isolation or uncertainty is taking control of what we can actually control. And so knowing that people are experiencing this stigma, how can we address stigma for ethnic minority groups during this time?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to think about responding, and I'm happy to kind of highlight a few things, but there are some great sort of resources I think that the DU website on COVID-19 has as well that I want to make sure people are aware of. But, certainly a good first step is to name and acknowledge that this is happening. And you have advocacy groups condemning anti-Asian racism. You have groups that are coming out and launching hotlines for people to kind of report, so we can get a sense of what this kind of looks like in terms of scale. Although we do know that with those reports, those tend to be underreported. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think both of you, Nicole and Christine, talked about the importance of having the information, right? This is not a Chinese virus, right? And so making sure that you are, informed and getting the information from reputable sources and really looking at critically, right? Through a critical lens. I think if you are someone who has experienced discrimination and microaggressions, I think, there are a number of different things to think about. I think particularly focusing on strengths and your core values, the things that motivate you to succeed, that this can really buffer against the negative effect of those incidences. Seeking support systems, reaching out when you're feeling overwhelmed or something has happened. Sometimes also getting involved, time and time again, I've heard in my work and with students, right, this desire right now to do something and to act, and how thinking about how some sort of activism or policy work or legislative work is a great way to kind of contribute positively, and can also be healing to feel like that you can tangibly do something or work towards something for the greater good. And then certainly, Christine, as you mentioned, right, psychotherapy can be incredibly helpful, particularly when thinking about how these incidences that are happening during an already stressful time, such as this pandemic, how that is impacting you and your sense of how you see yourself. And so being able to get some support to process some of that in psychotherapy can be incredibly helpful.
So Rohini, can you talk a little bit more about the economic disparities that we're seeing here?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to mention that. I think I'm mentioning that too. I mean, I think with a pandemic, which is very common in sort of disasters, what can really get illuminated and highlighted is the divide that exists between socioeconomic classes. And so a disaster like COVID-19 and other pandemics historically have really highlighted this, right? You have people living paycheck to paycheck, those in the service sector industry that are in very different positions in terms of the stressors that they're experiencing, particularly if they don't have salary jobs. Jobs in retail, hospitality, childcare, right? Those cannot be performed necessarily remotely. And so, and you already have kind of folks in those service industries, for example, right, already face low pay, uncertain hours, may not have good access to health care. And so, right, those disparities, particularly in access to health, are really highlighted. Right, there's a big difference, right, between those who are insured, those who are underinsured, and those who don't have insurance. And so you can really feel the stress of that, particularly during a time of a pandemic. And then when you have, Christine, I think you mentioned this, when you have sort of already existing conditions like diabetes, COPD, obesity, respiratory conditions, heart disease, those physical ailments, right, can exist in greater number in populations that don't have great access already due to the already existing social disparities. And that can certainly create more vulnerability and risk. So thanks, Nicole, for asking that, because certainly there are pretty big impacts when we think about the kind of socioeconomic differences and the ways that people are able to kind of respond, and the unique stressors that people are also experiencing. Yeah, any other, from Nicole, Christine, any other comments or questions before we take questions from the group from Anne?
I guess I'll say something, if that's all right, Christine.
Go ahead.
When we're looking at dealing with this change, there's that psychological concept that people have 4 choices to make, right? That you can choose to try to problem solve, in which case there are some things that we can try to problem solve. Who can you contact? Who can you connect with? What resources do you need or have access to? And then some of the other options that we have is to try to like change the way that you think or feel about it. And the feeling part, I'm not sure is as applicable here. I mean, these are all very understandable emotions that people are experiencing, but we do get that opportunity to change how we think about things, especially when it pertains to stigma. I think blaming is a very normal thing that comes out of being not in control. And so recognizing what that blame is doing. And the other options that we have, the other 2 would be to, stay miserable, which is not a choice that I think any of us want to make right now, or, excuse me, accept the situation. And right now, when we're feeling powerless, I do say that we have some responsibility here to accept that this is what's happening, and that doesn't mean that you're helpless or powerless. And so I really wanted to extend my appreciation to both like Rohini and Christine for naming the things that we can do as people in this situation to support not only our own well-being, but also the community and society that we live in.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Anne, yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to you for questions.
Yeah, you bet. I'm going to start with one just that I have for myself. I'm going to be totally selfish in this. Get on it. But one of the questions that I've been wondering is, you know, I need to take care of myself, and I'm working on ways to do that. I'm also finding that, you know, I don't have the kinds of degrees and backgrounds that you have, right? I'm an attorney. That's my background, and a strategist. And yet I'm finding myself as a leader, you know, within the university and in other circles, as a teammate, and frankly, as a family member and a mom. I want to support other people. And I sometimes don't feel like I have the skill set to do it in this kind of, you know, this is a trying time. So this is a time where I might refer people and say, hey, you should really talk to an expert. I can do that. But what advice do you have for those of us who want to care more, and to show up well? What do we do?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that. I'm sure Nicole and Christine do as well. I think, you know, listening goes a long way. I think bearing witness and creating a space, being able to check in with people and to really be present with what people are experiencing, I think can be incredibly powerful. And especially when there are a lot of stressors going on and people can feel like they're in crisis and going from one thing to the next, it can be hard to kind of slow down and check in with yourself, and then also have the presence to be there for other people. So whether that's building in that time, checking in with people who are close to you, kind of identifying who are those people you can reach out to, who have your back, who you know are there. I think there is such a power in bearing witness and being with, that I think can be still incredibly valuable even during a pandemic.
That's great. Do you have any specific advice? In talking, Christine, you had talked about sort of limiting our exposure to news.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on how to think about that for different age groups? So, you know, especially I'm thinking about, like, you know, little kids and teenagers and then adults, and where is the spectrum in there?
Yeah, well, I think when we think about little kids, we always want to show or put things on that are developmentally appropriate. So being sure to expose our children to things that fit their age group, and maybe needing to talk to them about some of the big scary words they heard. But so across the lifespan, as far as exposure to news, that'd be interesting to think about. I don't know, there probably isn't too much research out on that since all of this is happening so fast, but I know from, and maybe there is and someone can correct that, but I know from what I'm talking with people about and in my own personal experience, it's kind of a day by day or a week by week assessment. So I need to look at, where is my mood? Where is my self-care been? What's my anxiety and fear level? And is news gonna deplete me right now? Or is news gonna provide some sort of information or certainty that I'm craving? And so I guess I would ask everyone, you know, to think about for themselves, like, if I turn the news right now, is that gonna help me feel better and improve my mood? Or is that gonna put me into a downward spiral? So choosing in the moment, after we've assessed kind of where we're at, like what we need. So I don't know if I answered your question too much, because I think it's different for, it's based on the individual,
Sure.
What their history is, or life narratives, or trauma, or kind of mental health dynamics are of what they need in that moment and how they've been taking care of themselves.
Yeah. There's a question that has just come in. It's a little bit of a follow-on to this, and Rohini, you might have a specific answer. You talked about the importance of bearing witness. This listener is asking, how do you get people to open up a little bit so that you can bear witness, and in particular, with regard to children and teenagers, was the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I think in terms of getting people to open up, thinking about, you know, first of all, you know, already established relationships, right? I think thinking about those relationships, I think those that are already established, and there's a sense of kind of security where, you know, in those relationships, I think that can be developed through kind of being responsive and being available. And with that sort of foundation, I think some of those basic sort of, you know, skills around empathy that relate to kind of reflective listening, validating, normalizing what's going on, really kind of showing up in a non-judgmental way. I think that can be particularly helpful. I know that with teenagers, and luckily I don't have any yet, but they're growing, you know, I think it can be particularly hard because certainly there are different ways that people process it. And sometimes it's, sometimes people want to process it and sometimes people want to break from it. And that's also the way that you can show up in terms of, you know, whether you're, you know, we've been doing a lot of drawing here with my little kiddos and playing outside and trying to introduce some just ways that feel sort of normal and where we can still feel connected, right, amidst what's going on, that I think all of those kind of develop a sense of kind of security and safety.
Right.
That can help. And you know, when I want to talk to my son about something, I get out Uno. Because you know, there's something about like, right, doing something and having that, you know, he loves Uno, so feeling really comfortable in doing an activity that we want. And then it's like, you know, the conversations and questions come out. I'm sure some of you, you know, when you're in the car with your kiddos and it's like that car ride, right, like the questions that come up. So yeah. I think, you know, it's I think a lot of it, and Nicole talked about this, it's keeping that sense of security that allows for those conversations to happen.
Important. When it comes to so all of the different uncertainties, to just isolate one particular type of uncertainty, which is time, right? We just don't know how long this is going to go on for. And I know that there have been studies about how different people who've been in isolation, or maybe even prisoners of war, I remember reading one about that. What are some coping mechanisms for not having that up and down expectation of and just kind of being here for the long haul and being ready to do that? I would love to hear comments from any of you on that.
I can speak a little bit to it, and feel free, Christine and Rohini, to add to this. You know, I go back to like trying to really make this simple. And so when it comes to uncertainty, especially with time, I feel like the two biggest things that people can do to cope and support this is, one, finding the places that they do have control. You don't have control of time or how this country is responding to this, or how your job or your, you know, your school or what have you is responding to this. And so creating what you do have control over is really important. It goes back to that routine. But honestly, just trying to create a plan day by day, or even within the week, so that way we're not trying to live too much in the future. And I think that's where the like mental health part of uncertainty and time really start to play out, because it's very easy to get sucked into the what ifs. And it's very easy to get sucked into like not being able to plan for next month or next year or your birthday in 2 weeks or what have you. So bringing yourself back into the present and focusing on what is happening right now for you and what you need to get done. And then finding that balance too. What do you need to get done and what do you want to get done in this time? And so there's a little less room for guilt and shame for not accomplishing everything as well. I don't know if you two have anything else to add about that.
And my mind goes to grief and loss, and that's usually what I practice in. So of course, that's where my mind goes. But I see with the missed proms and graduations and weddings, and that there's so much loss. And I think we all need to give ourselves permission to grieve the loss of that imagined future. And so grieving it, like exploring what the loss of those events mean to us in our life, giving words to that pain, or giving sorrow words, and then eventually finding some sort of meaning in this all, in bigger perspective. And I think right now some of the meaning in our minds is that we're doing this for the betterment of mankind, or for our health and safety, and to stopping the spread, that there's meaning in that, but we also need to explore what the loss of these events signify and represent in our lives.
So glad you brought that up, Christine. I would absolutely agree. And to create that space is very important, because I think sometimes, especially being a student and being in this like problem solving mode, it can be very quickly to just like jump to resolve and fix it without creating that space. And that is something I'm watching people experience, whether it be missing their graduation or prom or birthday, even in my case. And so finding that space to say like, maybe there's something we can do to create as a substitute, but first I need to really mourn this. And I'm glad that you put that into words.
Yeah.
So we have another question about this routine, this idea of routine, to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. So you're mentioning that routine keeps some normalcy, and also then you can see where you can build in the flexibility. So this person is asking, clinically, how do you all balance that?
You know, I am pretty meticulous about scheduling. So even right next to me, even though I keep computer calendars, I don't know if you guys can see it, I keep daily written calendars, and I try to do that the night before or the day of and plan out my day. I need to have breakfast, shower, put my clothes on. I need to mark that transition into work. I need to make sure I'm getting a healthy diet and good sleep, so that then I can cognitively and mentally go do those things. So that's kind of the foundation. But that's how I do that, is really almost still like getting dressed like I'm going to work, even though I'm at home, in my home office. I need to keep a similar schedule with my kids who are doing homeschool here, that we also plan out, when do you have art, when do you have music, when do you have PE, you can't go outside today because it's raining. At 4 o'clock, I want you to build an obstacle course. So we're all planning out our days, and we can do that because we're also putting in really good self-care and health habits.
Yeah, I would agree with all those things. I so appreciate saying that, especially the routine, and like, it's kind of like learning how to like show up in your space when your space is work and home.
Right.
For a lot of us. And I think, you know, I've had to navigate that. One thing I've had to navigate that I think speaking of making meaning, that I don't realize how much actually I so value, is the transition time in between things. And, you know, in Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, it's so funny, when I scheduled all those, I wasn't thinking like, you know, 10 minutes in between this or 15 minutes in between that I would naturally get if I was walking right to another meeting. So I've had to really adjust and think about that. And it's like, how do I get out of this space, like outside, and build in some time in between those things as I naturally would? And then really also missing that, you know, those informal moments between colleagues in the hallways, or seeing students. And I was on with a call today with a group of students who are kind of mourning the same thing. And so I think building in that transitional space is so important. And then, you know, when we get back to sort of, you know, then it's like, wow, that's a really meaningful time, right? So here's something I can learn, like, I really value that. So that's something I think that I've just learned. And I think there's a lot of things to learn and to realize, wow, I think I've taken that for granted.
We have one person who's written in and just says, I find myself losing motivation and focus because I start feeling like nothing matters right now. I certainly have had my moment where I thought, how is the work that I'm doing relevant when this big thing is going on? And so she asked, with all the uncertainty, I wonder if things will ever really return to normal. What kind of advice or thoughts do you have?
It's a good question.
It's that hopelessness a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to, right, I think for me, for example, I'll talk about, like, sometimes if I sit back and think about, whoa, the big picture, it can feel so overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And that hopelessness can really sit in. And then it really sometimes helps to kind of funnel down to, like, okay, wait, what does this look like for me in my life? What does this look like for my family? What does this look like here? What are the things that I can do? Especially in thinking about, we think about the struggle that's happening universally. How do we help support one another and really kind of bring the community together? And so I guess, yes, I think when you think about it up here, it's overwhelming. And then you think about, wait, what can you do and how does this show up? And when you think about this, a year or 2 years from now, how do you want to think about this time and what you'll learn and how you handled it and who was there, who showed up, right? There's opportunities to feel connection in that hopelessness that I think at least helps me feel more motivated at times. But Nicole, Christine, I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
Similar, I think, my mind goes to thinking about importance and hope and resilience, but also values. So finding like, how do we want to stand up or show up in this time, and what's important to us, and what values do we move to, or want to hold in life, and then looking at, is there something that's that I'm not doing that I could be doing to get me there? So let's say losing motivation and feeling like nothing matters, and so maybe there's a value that things matter to me in life, or my friends matter. So how can I connect with that value and move towards that? Do I need to reach out more? How do I show up for that? So I agree with what you said, and finding ways to push through that loss of motivation and focus and stand up in these times.
And I'll just say before we move on to the next question, when we're looking at like lack of motivation, I think sometimes those two things, like lack of motivation and lack of focus, can go hand in hand with a little bit of apathy that comes in. It's that desire to check out. And so for someone who, again, I already shared this, like time management is hard, so is focus for me. And, we've talked about like control and routine, and those are helpful. But to me, I almost view it like a balance and like a dance. So instead of beating myself up or trying to fight me to have motivation, asking myself, like, what is it that makes me feel like I need to check out right now? Or what is it that where am I needing this space in my life? And sometimes that can help me figure out where I need motivation. Like, is it, or the other place is sometimes giving yourself that space to not do something in that moment. That's okay too. Like we've mentioned that these mental health implications are coming out for us. And so it's okay to watch an hour of Netflix sometimes. That's all right.
Sometimes more than an hour.
Yeah, well.
I watched 2 hours of The Voice last night. I'm gonna own it. I really did. And they were like old shows too. I just had to tune out.
I think Shelley was saying this, or Shelley Smith Acuna, in one of your webinars that Rohini has sent out to us, but she talked a lot about flexibility and compassion, and how in everything we're doing right now, we need to embrace that for ourselves and for the other people in our lives too. And if you want to watch 2 hours of The Voice,
yeah.
thumbs up here.
Yeah. So we have another question. What are some ideas for dealing with the lack of physical contact with other people? And that can be for all of us. It's, I think, particularly poignant for those who are living alone. And just talk about that a little bit, because video is just not the same. As warm and happy as we can all be right now, it's just not the same.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit to that in the isolation piece. And I wish we don't know what the changing days are going to bring. And I've heard recently that there's more, like, instead of 6 feet, it actually needs to be greater than that. So we need to be really careful to follow all of the data that's coming out about actually being in physical contact, and being outdoors. I think it's tricky because some people are alone, isolating on their own, singles at this time, and some people are surrounded by people that they may or may not want to be in their homes, and having a hard time separating or getting away from that. It was interesting. I was talking to my spouse about doing this presentation this morning. I was like, what do you think are some sources of stress during this time? And he said, husbands. Because he didn't want to make some coffee for me, so we were having a situation about the coffee. But it goes to show that even if you are surrounded with people, that there can be so much tension and like lack of distancing that's needed. So while I'm uncomfortable saying try to get like physical contact with people outdoors, like it's just not, I'm not in a medical place to be able to offer that, but I do think we need to reach out, whether it's phone calls or whether it's FaceTime or Zoom, and have meetings with your friends. With one of my families, we have a Zoom meeting set up every other day at like 5 p.m. And then you can just go on and connect to the people that are on. So I think we do have to find little ways to connect through video, whether it's looking at facial expressions or telling a funny joke or really listening about the emotion, that we need to reach out electronically as much as we can right now.
We played a little April Fool's joke virtually on my mom yesterday. My boys did, so that was kind of fun. But it added something to it to have a little bit of humor, and that was helpful. And she's just the best sport ever, so it was fine. There have been some really, I think, heartfelt thank yous, Rohini, for bringing up some of the stigma pieces. Gosh, that stuff is so hard. And so one of the questions here is, how do we address these sentiments as we move to an online forum and in an online forum? And then also, if you have any more comments about it, you talked a little bit about how to be an ally, but how do we take care of the mental health of the community that's been affected?
Yeah, I think, I think in terms of, again, naming these things when they happen are incredibly important. And I think, when we think about online formats as well, I mean, I think creating a place to have this dialogue and asking people about it and bringing these stories up so that it's not something that's invisible and something that gets, I think, hidden. I think when we think about taking care of the community, I think there goes a long way of like naming it and checking in on people. And when you see something, determining, right, can you intervene in that moment? Is it safe enough for you to do that? Are there, authorities around that can intervene? Checking in with, the individual who may have had something targeted that happened to them. I think, I say all of this because I think silence and pretending or dismissing, I think, can actually really hurt. And so what is the opposite of that? Naming, acknowledging that, checking in with people who've experienced that, I think is an important way to take care of the community. So those would be some ideas. But it's hard. It's really hard. This stuff is really hard anyways, let alone in a time when there's a pandemic, when it's really kind of illuminating some of the, terrible incidences and biases and stereotypes and just that can exist, right?
Yeah. I think it's, I find there are so many things that happen, outside of this COVID situation, but we're experiencing them in an extreme fashion now, and that, it's just been interesting. So I'm just going to ask each one of you to give a really brief answer, just one last question, which I love, which came from one of our grad fellows who works on C+V with me. And she was saying, keeping in mind community and values, what's the role of community in coping, and how do we activate our community to get through this? Just maybe one idea from each of you.
Yeah, I would say, the role of community, I really think, is connection. And I think the power of that and creating, I think about the concept of like creating a holding environment, right? Where we can hold space for each other and our experiences and our stories. And even they may not be alike or align, or there are ways that they are similar in the ways that they're not. I think that piece of being together and bearing witness, having experiences of that is really important. So I'll highlight that.
Okay.
I'm gonna go a little bit of a different direction with that because, you know, we've been talking about how we should like limit our news and what have you, and social media is also a part of that. And yet I'm finding myself focusing on the fact that although technology has been a giant piece in creating a wedge between people and their community and people and each other, it's now the thing that's bringing us all together. So maybe even utilizing that as a way to feel more connected to your community, more less isolated and more involved would be really helpful. I know many people, whether it be like Neighborhood, I think is the app, or yes, okay. So Neighborhood, or finding a group on Facebook, or just like bringing notes to your neighbors. I mean, just doing things in a way to communicate and feel connected would be incredibly important here.
Yeah, I agree with both Nicole and Rohini, and I would add acts of altruism, standing up for vulnerable communities in ways that Rohini suggested, and yeah, volunteerism. There's lots of organizations that you can sign up with right now to offer assistance down the road when we're not social distance. We're going to need a lot of help, and that we can offer up support and resources down there. I know as a psychologist in the community, one thing we're trying to do is to open up services to people who wouldn't readily have access to them. So offering sliding fee scales and discounts, and opening up online forums to groups, and try to access more people. And so I think as community psychologists, that's one way that we can do that, is just helping people get their supportive care that they need.
Yeah. Well, you do so much of that at GSPP. As I think many people know, I'm in awe of your school. I absolutely adore Shelley, your leader, and I have so much respect for the balance that you all have between being really gentle in how you bring your work to the community, but also being really forthright and creating a safe space for all of us. So it's, I think what you do is such a pillar to our community, and it's really important to this community plus values effort. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. I want to say thanks to everybody who could join us. We're a couple of minutes over, I apologize. But we are going to have some more of these online opportunities for us to connect. Next Tuesday, we're actually going to really be focusing on students. So if you are a student, or if you know some students who want to join in, we're going to have real talk with student leaders to just kind of let students get on and just kind of talk about how they're experiencing all of this. So that should be a really, I think, rich exchange. But again, Rohini and Christine and Nicole, I'm just really grateful. You've given me a lot to think about and a lot to feel, and that's important. So take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.